The pharmacy smelled the same way it had for 30 years. That's the first thing I noticed when I walked in that Tuesday morning. Antiseptic and something faintly floral, like someone had sprayed air freshener near the blood pressure machine by the door and given up halfway through. I had been coming to Hargrove's Pharmacy since my late husband and I moved to this town in 1991. Back then, Earl Hargrove himself stood behind the counter, a man so thin his white coat looked borrowed. Now his son ran the place, and the fluorescent light above the greeting card aisle still flickered the same way it had when my children were small. I was not there to pick up a prescription. I was there because I needed something to do with my hands for 20 minutes before my daughter-in-law's attorney called me back. I had been doing that a lot lately. Finding errands, filling time, keeping myself busy enough that I couldn't sit still long enough to feel the thing I didn't want to feel, which was doubt. I picked up a birthday card I didn't need and pretended to read it. My name is Vera. No, wait, let me start over, the way I should. My name doesn't matter as much as what happened, but I'll tell you that I'm 68 years old, that I have 2 sons, that I live alone in the house where I raised them, and that for the better part of 14 months I had been slowly, carefully, lovingly convinced that I could not manage my own life. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It started the winter after my husband passed. My younger son called more often, which I appreciated. He drove up from Raleigh on weekends, which I loved. He sat at my kitchen table and drank the coffee I made and told me I looked tired, which I was. He said the house was a lot for one person to keep up, which was true. He said property taxes in this county had gotten ridiculous, which I already knew. He said he and his wife had been talking, which is when I should have listened more carefully to what came next. They wanted me to sell. Not the house exactly. Not right away. They wanted me to consider a 55-plus community 40 minutes south near where they lived. Brand new units, a pool, an activities director, a shuttle to the grocery store on Thursdays. They had already taken a tour and brought back a brochure with photographs of silver-haired women laughing over what appeared to be a very competitive game of pickleball. I told them I would think about it. That was 13 months before the Tuesday I stood in Hargrove's reading a birthday card addressed to someone turning 40. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters. I was not dragged into this. I walked in with my eyes open and let them close slowly, the way you fall asleep somewhere unfamiliar and don't realize until you jerk awake that you'd gone under at all. My son wasn't a villain. His wife wasn't a villain. They loved me in the particular way that people love you, and also have decided what's best for you and cannot quite separate those two things. Over those months, I signed a financial power of attorney, temporary, my son said, just while I figured out next steps. I added his wife's name to my checking account for emergencies, she said, so someone could help if something happened. I agreed, in principle, to the idea of selling. We looked at units. I chose one. Almost. I initialed a folder of documents I read less carefully than I should have because my son was sitting next to me, patient and kind, and I did not want to be the kind of mother who treats her own child like a stranger. The closing was scheduled for a Thursday. This was the Monday before. I was standing in Hargrove's holding a birthday card for a 40-year-old I didn't know, and I was thinking about a conversation I'd had with my son's wife the previous Friday. She had mentioned very casually something about rolling my sale proceeds into a joint investment vehicle she and my son were exploring. She had used that phrase, joint investment vehicle, the way people use phrases they've practiced, smooth and quick, before moving on to something else. I had nodded. I had said that sounded interesting. I had thought about it for 3 days and could not shake the feeling that I had agreed to something I didn't understand and that the not understanding had been, at least in part, by design. The pharmacist's name was Gideon Marsh. He had worked at Hargrove's for 6 years and had filled my prescriptions, blood pressure, low-dose aspirin, vitamin D, without incident. He was maybe 40, with a kind of face that looked permanently like he was trying to remember if he'd turned off the stove. Unremarkable, steady, the kind of person you trust without thinking about it, the way you trust that the floor will hold your weight. I had moved from birthday cards to the reading glasses display. I didn't need reading glasses either. when he came around the counter. That was unusual. Gideon didn't usually leave his station in the middle of the afternoon. He walked up beside me and picked up a pair of reading glasses and pretended to look at the tag. "Mrs. Alderton," he said. "That's my name, Alderton." I turned to look at him, and something in his face made me go still. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to stay calm and keep looking at the glasses rack." I looked at the glasses rack. "The man who came in last week with you," he said, "the younger man, wearing a gray jacket." "My son," I said. "He came in again this morning," Gideon said. "He came in again this morning," Gideon said, "without you." He spoke to me for about 10 minutes. He wanted to know. He stopped, started again. He was asking whether you had any prescriptions for anxiety medication, whether your doctor had ever mentioned memory concerns. He asked if I thought your cognitive function seemed, he paused on the word, diminished. I kept looking at the glasses rack. "He said he was asking out of concern," Gideon said. "He said you'd been having some confusion lately. He wanted me to note anything I observed over the next few weeks." The birthday card display was turning slowly in my peripheral vision. Or maybe I was turning. I couldn't tell. "He left me his phone number," Gideon said quietly. I did not take it. I put down the reading glasses I was holding. My hands were steady. I was proud of that later. How steady my hands were. "How long ago was he here?" I said. 2 hours. I thought about the timeline. My son had called me that morning to confirm Thursday. He had sounded warm and normal and asked whether I needed him to bring anything. 2 hours later, he had driven 40 minutes to stand in my pharmacy and ask whether I showed signs of cognitive decline. I thought about the phrase joint investment vehicle. I thought about the power of attorney I had signed, which I had not, if I was being honest with myself, read all the way through. "Can I use your phone?" I said. Gideon looked at me. "My attorney," I said. "I'd like to call my own attorney. Not the one handling the closing." He handed me the phone behind the counter without another word. "I want to tell you something about Patricia Odom because she matters to this story more than almost anyone else in it." Patricia had been my attorney for 11 years. She did my will, handled a property dispute with a neighbor in 2019, and charged me rates that were probably too low because we'd gone to the same church for a decade, and she felt guilty about it. She was 63 years old, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and had a voice like someone who had spent years in rooms where she was the only woman and had decided to take up exactly as much space as she needed. I called her from behind the pharmacy counter. She picked up on the second ring. I told her as clearly as I could what Gideon had told me. I told her about the power of attorney. I told her about my name being on the checking account. I told her about the closing scheduled for Thursday and the phrase joint investment vehicle and the brochure with the pickleball women. There was a silence. "Don't sign anything Thursday," she said. "I wasn't planning to," I said, which was almost true. "Where are you right now?" "Hargrove's Pharmacy." Another silence, shorter. "I know where that is. Can you be at my office in an hour?" I handed the phone back to Gideon. He was facing away from me, doing something with a prescription bag that probably didn't need doing, giving me privacy in the small, considerate way that I have thought about many times since. "Thank you," I said. He nodded without turning around. "See you Thursday for your refill." As if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just handed me the thread I needed to find my way back out. I drove to Patricia's office with the radio off. I don't know why I remember that detail, the silence in the car, but I do. There was a field I passed on the way, brown and flat in early March, and I looked at it and thought about the 14 months I had spent being slowly, carefully, lovingly managed, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter, something like grief, but pointed inward at myself. For how easy it had been, for how much I had wanted to believe that their version of caring for me and caring about me were the same thing. I sat in the parking lot outside Patricia's building for 4 minutes before I went in. I know it was 4 minutes because I watched the clock on my dashboard. I sat there and thought about my son's voice that morning, warm and normal and asking if I needed him to bring anything. I thought about whether any part of what he'd done came from love. I decided it probably did. And I decided that didn't change what it was. Patricia was waiting for me. She had pulled the power of attorney documents before I arrived. She had also pulled my checking account authorization and the preliminary closing paperwork and laid everything on our conference table in a way that made the thing visible that I hadn't wanted to see, the shape of what had been built, piece by piece, over 14 months. She walked me through it without drama. That's something I appreciated about Patricia. She didn't perform outrage on my behalf. She just showed me the documents and told me what they said and what they allowed and what technically could have happened after Thursday. The power of attorney was not temporary. That word had never actually appeared in the document. I had heard it. I had believed it. It was not there. The account access was broader than I'd understood. The closing paperwork included a clause routing net proceeds to a joint account that my son and his wife held, not a joint account with me, with each other. I sat with that for a moment. "Can this be undone?" I said. "The POA can be revoked," Patricia said. "The account authorization can be removed. The closing can be postponed or canceled entirely since you haven't signed the final documents yet." "He's going to know," I said. Patricia looked at me over her reading glasses. "Yes," she said, "he will." I spent 2 days doing what Patricia told me to do. I revoked the power of attorney and sent the notification by certified mail. I removed my son's wife from my checking account. I called the closing attorney, not my son's attorney, the one handling the transaction, and told him I was postponing, and listened to him stammer for a moment before regaining his professional footing. I did not call my son. He called me. He called me the morning of what would have been Thursday, 4 hours before the closing. It wasn't happening. I let it ring the first time. The second time I answered. He was not angry at first. He was worried. He asked if I was okay. He said he'd heard from the closing attorney and that he was confused, that he thought we'd agreed, that he just wanted to understand what had changed. I told him what had changed. I told him about Gideon. I told him about Patricia's conference table and everything laid out on it. I told him about the word temporary and how it hadn't appeared in the document. I told him about the joint account clause. There was a long silence. "Mom," he said, "I know you love me," I said. "I've never doubted that." "I was trying to help you," he said. Were trying to help you," he said. "You were struggling." "I know you believe that," I said. "The POA was just in case something." "I know," I said. "I understand what you were building. I think you understood it too, and I think that's the part we're going to have to work through." He didn't say anything for a while. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller. Not the voice of someone presenting a plan, the voice of someone who had just been shown clearly what they'd done. "I don't know if our relationship will be the same. I think it will be different, and I think different isn't the same as broken, but I haven't decided yet. What I know is that I am still in my house, that the title is in my name alone, that my checking account has my name on it and no one else's, that I had my blood pressure checked last week and it's actually better than it was in January. I saw Gideon on Thursday the way he'd said. I was there for my refill. He handed me the bag across the counter and I thanked him and he nodded the same way he always did, that small, steady nod, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. I said, "I want you to know it worked out." He said, "I'm glad to hear that." And then there was a woman behind me waiting for her prescription, and he turned to help her, and that was all. No speech, no moment. Just a man at a counter doing his job, which had included, on one unremarkable Monday afternoon, deciding to walk around the counter and say something he wasn't required to say to a woman holding a birthday card she didn't need. I've thought about that a lot, about what it takes to do a thing like that. To notice and to speak. To risk being wrong or unwelcome or misunderstood, because the alternative is staying quiet while someone loses something they can't get back. There is a framed piece of paper on the wall of my study now. It's the letter from the attorney's office confirming revocation of the power of attorney. My daughter, I have a daughter too. She lives in Phoenix. She cried when I told her the whole story. She said I should frame something better. A photo. A painting. I told her this was the thing I wanted to look at. Not because it's a victory. I'm not interested in calling it that. But because there are days when I doubt myself, when I wonder if I overreacted, if my son's intentions were good enough to excuse the rest, if the kind and gentle pressure of the people who love you is actually a kind of harm, and on those days, I look at that letter. It's in my handwriting, one of the lines, a single sentence I added at the bottom, outside the formal language, before I mailed it. It says, "I have not lost my mind. I am simply paying better attention. I know that. Now, there is a pharmacy 40 minutes from my house that smells like antiseptic and faint artificial flowers. And inside it, there is a man named Gideon Marsh who said something true on a Monday afternoon when he could have said nothing. I go out of my way to fill my prescriptions there. I will keep going out of my way for as long as he is behind that counter. Some debts are not financial. Some of the most important ones never are. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. That's one of the things nobody tells you about getting older. You have more time to think, and the thinking gets heavier. What I keep coming back to is not the paperwork, not the clause in the closing documents, not the account access, not even the phrase joint investment vehicle, which I still can't hear without my jaw tightening. What I keep coming back to is how ordinary all of it looked, how warm, how reasonable every single step felt, right up until Patricia laid it all out on that conference table and the shape of it became impossible to unsee. That's the thing about being slowly managed by someone who loves you. It doesn't feel like harm. It feels like help. And the longer you accept the help, the harder it becomes to locate the moment it stopped being one thing and started being the other. I've wondered whether my son ever drew a clear line in his own mind, or whether it all happened the way it happened to me, gradually, each step following the last so naturally that there was never a moment that felt like a choice. I don't have an answer to that. I may never have one. What I do know is this: the consequences of what was being built were real, regardless of the intentions behind them. That's not a comforting idea, but I found it to be a clarifying one. The document said what it said. The account access was what it was. Good intentions don't revise the terms of a legal instrument, and the woman who would have signed her name on Thursday 4 months ago would have found that out the hard way if Gideon Marsh hadn't walked around a counter on a Monday afternoon. I think about that choice a lot. He had every reason not to say anything. He could have told himself it wasn't his business. He could have told himself he was probably wrong, that it was a family matter, that getting involved would cause problems. He had my son's phone number in his hand and chose not to take it. That's not a small thing. That's someone deciding that staying quiet in that moment would have been its own kind of action and choosing differently. There's something I've been trying to hold on to since all of this happened, something I want to pass on if I can find the right words for it. Intelligence alone didn't protect me. I am not an unintelligent woman. I read documents for 30 years as part of my work. I raised 2 children and ran a household and managed my own finances for 4 decades. None of that stopped me from initialing a folder I hadn't read carefully, because I was sitting next to someone I loved, and I didn't want to treat him like a stranger. What eventually protected me was paying attention, not suspicion. Attention. There's a difference. Suspicion closes you off. Attention keeps you present. It was attention that made me feel something shift when I heard that phrase on a Friday afternoon, attention that made me drive to a pharmacy instead of going home. And it was Gideon's attention, the quiet, steady kind, the kind that noticed something worth noticing and acted on it, that gave me the threat I needed. I am 68 years old. I live in my own house with my name on the title and no one else's. I have a letter framed on my wall that most people would find an odd thing to display. And I have a pharmacist 40 minutes away who nods at me on Thursdays like nothing out of the ordinary ever happened between us. I think that's what integrity looks like when it's not performing. It just does what it does and then turns back to the work.